Our guest speaker this evening, Collin Harris, I'm quite sure is well known to many of you. Collin, I understand, has retired this week after 30-something years as Director of the Biodiversity and Conservation Section of the Department of Water, Land and Biodiversity Conservation. So now that he's in retirement, he seems to have time to come out and entertain us. Collin, we're looking forward very much to hearing your talk this evening, Marginal Lands, Marginal Land Use, the Historical Geography of the South Australian Malley, the Murray Mallee. Please make welcome Collin Harris.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, David. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually my last day today. And it's actually nice to be talking about the Murray Mallee on my last day, officially working. Since that's really where my career began, I guess. I first became interested in the Murray Mallee through doing some honours work there in the 1960s, student in the Geography Department at Adelaide Uni. And, there was actually a significant drought in the Murray Mallee at that time, and there was a lot of publicity about the marginality of the Murray Mallee. And I can remember the late Professor Lawton saying, well, look, you're interested in biogeography, you're interested in land settlement patterns, there's a bad drought up there at the moment, why don't you go up there and have a look? And out of that came some honours work, and really almost a lifelong interest in the Murray Mallee. I've kept going back, and it's just a fascinating place, as I hope I'll demonstrate tonight. So, when I was doing that honours work, which I've mentioned, I came across a rather nice quote, a rather elegant quote by a couple of American geographers, Wagner and Meitzel. And it was, my interpretation of what they were saying is a bit literal, but it amounted to what I've got up the top there. What they said was that any sign of human activity in a landscape implies a culture, recalls a history, and demands an ecological interpretation. And I think that's rather nice. And it's almost a dictum or a maxim that I've sort of worked with ever since. When I look around and I see the imprint of human activity in the landscape, those words always come back to me. I think it's just a very elegant way of talking about the interaction really between humankind and their environment, the history of humankind, the culture that produces the type of activity that they engage in, and the subsequent imprint of their activity on the landscape. Human activity is really, in the Murray Mallee, is what I really want to look at tonight, and it's clearly measured in thousands of years. We're not just talking about the last 150 years of European activity in that country. We're talking about thousands of years of Indigenous occupation preceding any European activity in there. But I guess the prevailing theme of what I want to talk about tonight is that this is not easy country. It never has been easy country for humankind. It really is a difficult environment in many respects, in fact in most respects, for human activity. And I guess that comes back to the fact that this is dry country, not only in a rainfall sense, but also in the fact that there is very little surface drainage, and I'll return to that in a moment. This is, with the exception of the Murray, that there's virtually no surface streams or no surface rivers in the Murray Mallee. And that dearth of water really did restrict Indigenous use of the environment. That same lack of water and relatively poor pastures also inhibited pastoral use, which was the first layer of settlement by Europeans. And I'm really talking, just in parenthesis, I'm really talking about 3 layers of human activity and 3 sort of periods of human settlement and their interaction with the environment. I'm talking about the Indigenous occupation, the pastoral occupation, and the pastoral occupation preceded the agricultural occupation, which is the settlement activity, which we've got up there currently. So 3 really quite different and distinctive ways of using the environment. The people involved in each of those waves or phases of settlement interacted with the land in significantly different ways, and their imprint on the land was significantly different. The agriculture, which is still with us today up there, is challenged, continues to be challenged by the low and erratic rainfall as we saw last year, a disastrously dry year, but by no means unusual. And I think one could sort of generalise and say, well, in Australia generally, we tend to regard droughts as something unusual. We really should not regard droughts as something unusual. We should regard them as just a normal part of the climatic flux. This is dry country, our rainfall patterns are erratic, and there's every indication that they'll be more erratic into the future with climate change. This is a rather wishy-washy map. It hasn't come out as sharply as I would have wished, or as brightly, but I'll just talk about a few locational features just so that I can get you orientated. The area that I'm really talking about today, the Murray Mallee that I'm talking about, starts really where the Murray Mallee gives way to the upper southeast in the southern areas. So I'm really talking about the country from the sort of Pinaroo-Lameroo line, the country through here, right through to the River Murray itself, and for some little distance north of the River Murray. And I'm also talking about what many people talk about as the Murray Flats, west of the River Murray. So I'm really, that's my sweep of country. The main sort of geographical features, you can see the river snaking its way sort of south down around the great sort of Catarapco-Loxton Bend here, continuing on to what used to be called the Northwest Bend that we now call Morgan, where it hits the Morgan Burra Fault and gets funnelled south to eventually emerge through the lakes, well, with some difficulty at the moment, into the Southern Ocean. Ancestrally, the Murray used to, before the faulting and uplift of the Mount Lofty Ranges, the Murray actually emptied itself into the Gulf to the west. But with the emergence of those uplifted fault areas, it was pushed southwards. So that's really the area that we're talking about. The principal sort of modern towns, Loxton on the River, probably best known for its irrigation, but it has been also an important settlement area for dryland agriculture. Waikerie, much the same. Blanchetown over here, Swan Reach, and then over here we've got Allawoona, towns like that, and down here we've got Karoonda, and then further south down here we've got the Pinaroo-Lameroo railway line and the Malley Highway through to Victoria and New South Wales. So that's really the definition of what I'm talking about. Now let me come back to the nature of the country. I talked in my opening remarks about the fact that this is difficult country, and it's primarily difficult through a combination of that low and erratic rainfall, which I've mentioned, and the absence of surface rivers and streams. The actual rainfall totals that we're talking about decrease from around about, in the old terms, for those in the audience that can relate more to inches than millimetres, around about 15 or 16 inches average per annum in the south and the west, to 10 inches or less in the northern part of this area that I'm talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, droughts are frequent. The region, almost the entire region, is underlain by tertiary marine limestones that were bedded during periods of marine inundation over that country in geological times. But in addition, that the calcareous-rich marine limestones have produced through soil forming processes, pedogenesis processes, they've produced very calcareous surface horizons, which are very well jointed. Don't worry too much about the technicalities. I'll show you a slide of those in a minute. But what it means is that through a combination of the marine limestones and the very well jointed limestone surface horizons that have formed more recently over the tertiary limestones, what rainfall falls tends to go straight through very quickly. But the limestone is very porous, in effect. It's got these joints, the water goes rapidly down through the joints and is effectively lost before it can coalesce into streams and rivers. The soils are very variable in this country. In the northern part of the Malley, the soils in more arid dune building periods, in relatively recent times geologically, have been built into east-west aligned dunes, and they're sort of typically red-brown, so-called Wirinan sands, whereas once you get down below Pinaroo and Lameroo, there are different, they've got different geological origins. The sands down there, they're what we call Molyneux sands. They're white sands. They're a bleached type of nutrient-deficient sand by comparison with the red-brown sands of the north. And they don't have that classic east-west lineal alignment of the northern Malley. But in addition to those two main kinds of alignments of sands, we've got plains country, what locally commonly called plains country, over massive Ripon calcrete. Now again, the Ripon is just a locality on the west coast where this calcrete, this massive lime horizon, those of you that know the Malley will know what I'm talking about here. It's very, very stony. Much of it is nodular, but you get areas where the limestone is just massive. It's in effect concreted together, and that's described as so-called rip-on calcary. And there you've got very, very thin skeletal soils, or almost no soils at all, over this rip-on calcary. The vegetation of this country is much more variable than most people think. The name Malley, you'll see books will commonly say, well, it's a corruption of an Aboriginal name, Malley. It may be Europeanisation of indigenous names. It could really have been anything. One guesses, but that's supposedly the common derivation of the term, and it refers to the Malley growth habit, that typical multi-stemmed branching habit of mallees, and I'll show some slides of that in a minute. In the south, where you've got higher rainfall, you have an understory of prickly shrubs, not dissimilar to the type of understory you get in some of the lower rainfall areas in the lofty ranges, but that changes with decreasing rainfall to a more typical arid element, semi-arid element of blue bush and salt bushes and things like that under the Malley in the north. And then very distinctively on those rip-on calcary areas that I'm talking about, you get open grassy plains, which are quite different again. And I think we'll actually have a look at those now. I guess this tends to be the typical Malley that most people associate within their minds, i.e. the multi-stemmed growth habit. A relatively low whipstick type of growth habit, in this case over one of those east-west sandy rises in the northern Malley that I was talking about, a triodia ring, commonly called porcupine grass or spinifex, but most people would regard that as a fairly typical type of open Malley scrub, which once covered vast areas up there. In the southern areas with higher rainfall, you tend to get more substantial growth of the individual species of mallees, more substantial trunks on them. But again, fairly sparse understory in spite of the relatively high rainfall in this country. Some dryland tea tree forming an understory there, some various native grasses there as well. But again, reasonably typical, we suspect, of what a lot of this country, particularly in the southern parts of the Malley, would have once looked like. It is sandy country, a lot of it. This is down in the more southerly areas. This is some of the Molineux sands that I was talking about, although right on the edge of where that country gives way to more of the red-brown sand. So there's perhaps a greater coloration of red-brown in this than you get as you move further south towards the upper southeast. But again, quite distinctively sandy. The hill in the background, the little prominence there, is more characteristic of the southern margins of the Malley. This is the white Molineux sands that I've been talking about, again with triodia rings growing in the foreground. And when you move even further south, you get into a jumbled array of these big white sandhills with high rainfall elements. I mean, this is really where the classical Malley of the kind that I'm mainly talking about tonight is starting to grade into the Malley heath country of the upper southeast. I mean, you don't get sharp sort of biogeographical barriers generally in the environment. You tend to get transition zones, and this is one of those transition zones where the Malley is giving way to the upper southeast. But I mentioned that the Malley is more variable than we tend to think, and you might believe at first glance that this is country which has been cleared at some stage by European activity for grazing or for cropping, but that's absolutely not the case. That's one of the open grassy plains, which were described by the very first Europeans to view this country. Sturt, in his boat voyage down the Murray, talked about the scrub, but he also talked about the open plains, as did almost every subsequent explorer who had anything to do with this country. And we believe that they probably were mostly grassy. They tend to have been described by the explorers as grassy. In this case, speargrass type of species hayed off now some time after the rain has fallen, which produced that prolific growth. But you certainly can find evidence, especially around areas like Morgan and Blanchetown, of a chenopod element on these plains as well, salt bushes and blue bushes, more characteristic of low rainfall country or lower rainfall country further north. So they were probably a mixture of grasses and chenopod shrubland. But they did have this distinctive absence, quite distinctive absence, of large mallees. This is the type of calcareous horizon you get formed over those tertiary limestones. Those marine limestones which I talked about are high in calcium, rich in calcium, and over a long period of time geologically that calcium is mobilised by rainfall. It's then precipitated out, and it hardens over time into these concretionary horizons that we see, or the little nodules which we see. They're a little bit like onions when you crack them open. You can see concentric growth rings on them almost, and that's indeed how they form as mobilised calcium moves through the soil profile, precipitating out and building and forming, and that's a very, very typical soil profile for a lot of the Malley country, particularly over those plains, which I was showing a moment ago. Look, I'll just go back. It's a long voyage back. Yes, here we go. One of the interesting things about the Malley, which I omitted to mention in talking to these slides, is that although that word Malley, or Malley, is supposed to refer to the multi-stem growth habit of the Malleys, which I was showing earlier on, it's interesting that if you plant a Malley in this country, whilst it may grow from the start with multi-stems, particularly if the seasons are pretty dry when you plant them, characteristically, or more characteristically, they'll tend to grow with only one stem or a couple of main stems. That habit of throwing up, as you can see there, that clump on the right, which has got about 6 or 7 stems coming from it, that's a response to disturbance, either by fire or by some form of mechanical disturbance, by axing or by chaining from bulldozers or something like that. But fire will produce that. What happens when you get fire, for example, in this country? The stems are actually killed off by the fire. But the massive lignotuber that would commonly the Mallee root, I think everyone in South Australia is familiar with the Mallee root, or the Mallee stump, as it's sometimes called. That's really a massive, in botanical terms, that's a massive sort of tuberous swelling at ground level and extending to some distance below the ground, and that's got a remarkable regenerative capacity to produce multi-stemmed regrowth after that disturbance. So whilst it's a little bit like the story about sort of axes and axe handles and all that old joke about, people talk about mallees being sort of thousands of years old, well, or many, many hundreds of years old. Well, the individual stems are not. It's like an axe handle, it's, the stems disappear in a fire, but the lignotuber persists, and so you get a new stem coming up again. But it is rather interesting. So when you look at a Mallee, perhaps just reflect on the fact that what you're really looking at is a disturbed or a response, a growth response to disturbance. And most of the Mallee, which you will see in your travels throughout this country, has been disturbed many times, either by fire or by axing. There was a lot of clearance of Mallee, or cutting of Mallee, for the firewood trade, and the result was regrowth of this kind. The farmers in that country talk about first growth Mallee, and by first growth Mallee they're talking about mallees, individual mallees, which have not been disturbed for a long time, and have either got a single trunk or perhaps at the most a couple of trunks, as opposed to second or third growth. Where perhaps on 2 occasions in the 20th century there's been a program of cutting, axing, and on each occasion the mallee's grown back, second and third growth. Okay, so that's really an introduction to the nature of the country. Let's talk about Indigenous or Aboriginal occupation. There's always been a fruitful source of debate about the longevity of Aboriginal occupation of southern Australia. The debate goes on. I think it's certainly safe to say that we're looking at least 40 to 50,000 years before the present, probably considerably longer than that. But in the Malley at least, that occupation almost certainly wouldn't have been continuous. I mentioned when I was talking about the dunes that occupy this country that there have been arid phases. In relatively recent geological times, there have been arid phases when the rainfall has been very, very low, much too low to support the type of continuous Mallee vegetation cover that would have been there at the time of European settlement. And that was a period of dune construction when the soils were destabilised, they were bare, by and large bare of vegetative cover, and that's when the very, very strong prevailing westerly and southwesterly winds piled all the sand up into those lineal east-west dunes, which you see in the northern Murray Mallee. And it's almost inconceivable that there would have been any permanent human occupation of the country at that time. So I think Indigenous occupation of it would have ebbed and flowed according to the climatic cycles associated with the glacial and interglacial periods of relatively recent geological time. When Europeans first started talking about the Malley and travelling through it, they saw relatively little evidence of Indigenous occupation. And on the basis of that, they concluded that Indigenous use of the region was seasonal or opportunistic at best. And in fact, really well into the 20th century, a number of workers in the field were still writing that there was no permanent Indigenous Aboriginal occupation of the Malley, the northern Murray Mallee. They were saying that the people only went out into this country after heavy rain. They based themselves on the River Murray, and they would go out on forays into this country when the rainfall allowed. But certainly, I don't think there's any doubt that that happened. Eyre, for example, talks in his journals about how the Indigenous people living along the river were very fond of going out into the back country, as they called it, i.e. the Malley country, because it represented a change in diet. So they got tired of eating fish and eating freshwater mussels all the time. So when the rainfall allowed, they would go into the Malley country for a change of diet. But there's not much doubt in my mind that there was permanent occupation or quasi-permanent occupation, even of the northern Murray Mallee, and I'll show you some slides which I think illustrate how that could certainly have been the case. And we definitely know that there was permanent, more or less permanent, occupation of the southern Malley, because down in the southern Malley there are freshwater soaks, and they can be regarded as more or less permanent. It was too dry in the northern Murray Mallee for freshwater soaks by and large, but there were other sources of water, which I'll show some examples of. Even in the driest parts of the Malley, there are things called solution holes. Holes in the limestone that hold water, some considerable quantities of water after rain. There are clay pans, and in extreme times, we know that the Indigenous people were very adept at getting moisture out of Mallee and hakea roots. And there were also access arrangements to the Murray, according to people like Tyndale, workers like Norman Tyndale. He wrote of how in extremely low rainfall seasons that there was an understanding that Indigenous people who would normally be living in the southern Malley on a more or less permanent basis would be allowed to fall back to the river at pre-arranged, pre-agreed spots. They would be allowed access to the river so they didn't perish from lack of water in these extremely dry times. As I mentioned, Edward John Eyre, who I think was a very acute observer of Indigenous people and the way they interacted with the land. And not only that, but he was also very familiar with the Malley. And not only because he was based at Murundi on the river, just south of Blanchetown for some time, but also he saw a lot of the Malley in his travels onto Eyre Peninsula and eventually over the far west coast along the Nullarbor to Albany in Western Australia, that epic journey of his. And on the basis of his close familiarity with the Malley, he had some very interesting things to say about it, and this was one of them. What he's saying there is that this country, which in the eyes of Europeans is the most barren and worthless, this is a country which the natives is the most valuable and productive. Now, he's not calling it Malley, it's too early for that, but he's saying such are the dense brushes or sandy tracts of country covered with shrubs. For here the wallaby, the opossum, the kangaroo rat, the bandicoot, the leopoa, and by leopoa he's talking about the Mallee fowl, snakes, lizards, iguanas, and many other animals, reptiles, birds, etc. abound, whilst the kangaroo, the emu, and the native dog are found upon their borders. So, you know, this, having said at the outset, this is a difficult country, and so it always has been for humankind. When water was available, it really did represent, especially to Indigenous people, quite a rich hunting ground, and as I mentioned, a very welcome one from a change of diet point of view. What can we say about the impact of Indigenous people on the land? We've talked about how they had to shape their activities to fit in with the rhythms of the season and the dearth of surface water. It really has to be speculation, but it's interesting speculation, it's tantalising speculation. And of course there's a prodigious debate still going on in the scientific community between people like Tim Flannery and his supporters who believe that Indigenous people have had a profound effect on the Australian landscape. The Flannery school of thought, and he's certainly not the first, there are many people before Flannery, But there's certainly a school of thought which has been arguing for some time, probably for 30 or 40 years now, that the impact of Indigenous people on the landscape is much more profound than we previously thought. We know that they introduced the dingo relatively recently, perhaps as recently as only 4,000 years ago. We know that they used fire systematically for all sorts of purposes. And the impact of those fire regimes on the vegetation is again something to be speculated about. And there were probably hunting pressures. I mean, it's very interesting, for example, there's been archaeological excavations at Devon Downs on the River Murray, just to, well, really within this Malley country, which have produced all sorts of skeletal remains of many, many small mammals, which certainly were in were in that country in relatively recent geological times, but which, if they were present when Europeans first came in and collected in the area, must have been there in vanishingly small numbers, because they just don't feature in most of the early natural history literature, yet they're there in the archaeological record, and that's really tantalising. Now, what does that mean? Is it through relatively recent climate change that those small mammals have disappeared, or seem to have disappeared even by the time Europeans got into the country? Or is it that they were there in very small numbers and Europeans didn't really know how to find them, and with all the changes that came with European occupation they got pushed over the brink? We'll never really know. But it really is interesting stuff, and as I say, it's a very live debate, which gets into the popular scientific literature from time to time. I would sort of say, you know, that the jury's probably always going to be out on it. I don't know how you will ever prove this conclusively one way or the other, but my own view certainly is that you can't ignore Indigenous impact on this land. It certainly wasn't as benign, in my view, as a lot of early writers would have believed. We probably even my generation were taught in the schools that Aboriginal people lived in some sort of marvellous equilibrium with the land, that they had a benign impact on it, that everything was stable and unchanging. I just don't believe we can hold to that view. Okay, now I think we'll turn that off. This one. The evidence for Aboriginal occupation of this country, as I say, is thin in the literature, but it's not necessarily thin on the ground. The scatter of stony material which you see in that blown out dune is not accidental. That's not naturally occurring stone. That's granite, it's basalts from the western districts of Victoria, it's chert brought in from the river up near Berry. That is material brought in by Indigenous people, and that's in effect a workshop where the people would sit around doing their flaking, their manufacture of stone implements of various shapes, sizes and descriptions. It's where the cooking was done. They would sleep in this area. You can still find the hearths, you can still find burnt bone material in the hearths, you can find fragments of mallee fowl shells, emu shells. The evidence, the archaeological evidence, the straight archaeological evidence for Aboriginal occupation of the country is still very visible. After blows, after strong wind events, you still get skeletons being exposed. This is Jimmy's Well, and it's well known as a burial site. So really, I mean, it's quite clear that Aboriginal people were there. Now, how did they survive? I mentioned that in the southern parts of the Malley there were freshwater soaks, and this is a typical freshwater soak down on the northern edge of Narcat Conservation Park. This is Periparitch soak. The mechanism for that water, I mean, there's really, these soaks are wonderful features. You go this sandy country where you think no water could ever accumulate, and then you'll come across these marvellous little soaks, these freshwater soaks, very, very fresh, clean water. And the reason it is so fresh and clean is that it's all just collected locally. This is rainwater, which has fallen locally on those sandy rises. The rainwater has just filtered down through the sand until it's hit a clay layer, and it's perched on the clay layer. It can't go any further. The clay is relatively impervious. And so the fresh water is just sitting on this clay horizon, and the Indigenous people have discovered this in the past. They've scratched the sand away, they've exposed the water, and here you have a classic little freshwater soak. And there are many, many of them in the southern Malley. And the better ones can be regarded as more or less permanent. But the really large ones like scorpion soap. And it's interesting that around them, the country is relatively open. And Tyndale, when in writing about this sort of phenomenon in Central Australia, used to, well, he held that the importance of a soak or a rock waterhole could be judged by the extent of clear country around it. What he was saying was that there was intense human activity, indigenous activity around these soakages and these rock holes for long periods of time, and so there was disturbance. And the better the water, the more camping there was around it, the more disturbance over hundreds, thousands of years, and so the more open it was. And there seems to be some evidence for that view of people like Tyndale, in as much as in areas like Narkat, which are now conservation park or national park, where there's no grazing and no relatively, people aren't camping there in the numbers that Indigenous people were. And there's some evidence of recolonisation of these open areas by trees and understory shrubs. So it's rather interesting to speculate again on this sort of impact of localised impact of Aboriginal people. Puddled clay pans were another source of water for Indigenous people. When we talk about puddled clay pans, we're talking about clay pans which have, in some cases, probably naturally good at holding water, but in other cases where they've been the Indigenous people deliberately trampled on them to increase the compaction of the clay, to increase their water retentive capacity, and that's described by a number of early observers. They actually saw this going on, and you can find evidence of this in the southern Malley especially. I mentioned that solution holes in the limestone will also hold a lot of water. These are a couple of fairly typical solution holes, and these have got the original capstones on them. These are stones that, what you can't see here, because the capstone's still in place, what you can't see here is that there's quite a substantial little cavity, sort of little cavernous hollow under this surface limestone. The rainwater, with heavy rainfall events, runs off the bare rock down into these little miniature caverns and lodges there. The limestone is so hard that it's relatively impervious, and these little cisterns or these little rock holes hold quite significant quantities of water, and the Indigenous people put these capstones over them to stop animals getting to the water and to stop pollution, to keep dirt out and to keep birds and creatures out, to appropriate them for their own use. That they occur quite widely throughout the northern Murray Mallee especially. That's probably, in a nutshell, what we can say about Aboriginal occupation. We don't know terribly much about it. A lot of it is speculation, reconstruction based on fairly scanty early descriptions. So let's move on to early European exploration and attitudes to the Mallee. Well, they weren't very impressed, to put it mildly. The Mallee was regarded as waterless and inhospitable. Note the recurring theme there. Sturt in 1829 talks about the country as barren and unproductive as the worst we have passed through. Major Mitchell, one of the most barren regions in the world. Edward John Eyre, notwithstanding that he understood the Mallee much better than Sturt or Mitchell, still said the country is very sandy and barren, no grass could be procured for the horses. That's after he nearly came to grief, trying to drive cattle through the Victorian Mallee, what we'd now call the Big Desert, and he only barely escaped with his life, and it created quite, in his mind, a profound respect for the country. By 1842, as early as 1842, Europeans were referring to the southern Mallee as desert. That sort of terminology persisted well into the 1950s in South Australia with our 90-mile desert appellation before it became the Cunalpan Downs, and of course it remains today. In Victoria they still talk about their big and little deserts down in the southern bottom end of their Mallee country. So really the early European impressions weren't terribly favourable. However, pastoralism was an occupation much sought after by speculative investors and men of substance in the early colony, and they were keen to utilise the country for very cheap raising of sheep and cattle wherever they could. They couldn't get into the Mallee early on. The reports of the explorers, which we've looked at there, indicated very clearly that this was a pretty difficult country, and so there were no early moves to the pasture stock, notwithstanding the open grassy plains. There was some seasonal use from the River Murray frontages. The River Murray frontages were taken up for pastoralism very early on, and sheep and cattle would wander back into the Malley country, particularly in the cool months of the year when they don't need as much water as they normally do. But more intensive occupation had to await the installation of water points. And you would appreciate from the slides and what I've been talking about that the Malley country has surface soils that are not really very amenable to dams. The limestone's just too porous. The number of clay flats where you can put down dams are pretty limited. And so they had to go down. They had to find underground water. And they eventually did discover that if they went down to about 50 metres or more, there was underground water. Pretty salty, pretty saline, but it was okay for stock. And so they started from the late 1850s putting wells down. Very, very expensive things to construct. Deep, with all the difficulties that attend deep well sinking. And of course, once you're down 50 metres or more, you've got the problem of how to get the water up to the surface. And in the Malley, they used either winds, which are horse-powered structures, I'll show you one in a moment, or they used steam pumps. They tended to use winds in the southern Malley and steam pumps in the north, and I don't know why. If anyone can tell me afterwards why they used winds in the south and steam pumps in the north, please do. That whether you used winds or whether you used steam pumps, you were looking at big money. For example, at Garra Well, down near Lameroo, one well alone was valued on expiry of the lease in the early 1890s at £342, which was worth almost as much as all the building complex at Garra Well, Garra Head Station. Garra was a substantial head station, yet one well was almost as valuable as all the buildings combined at Garra Station. So it was not country for those without big capital behind them. But was it a success? The answer has to be no. The pastures were pretty indifferent, you would have to say. With the exception of those open grassy areas that I showed you before, this was not good grazing country. They tried to increase its grazing capacity by firing it in country which would carry fire, but even that was not overly successful. Once you fire Malley, even if in Spinifex country you can fire it, but then you've got to wait another 5 or 6 years before you get enough fuel to carry the fire again. So you get a couple of years green pick after firing, but it's not on a rotational basis, which they did, we know. You would carry some stock, you'd carry wethers on the country, but it wasn't. By no stretch of the imagination could you describe it as good pastoral country. And then rabbits got in the 1880s, and they absolutely decimated the country. I haven't got time to give you quotes, but there are some famous quotes from a Royal Commission in the Victorian Malley, where they talked about rabbits even climbing trees, just stripping all the bark and the leaves off the Malley trees. It was just extraordinary. And of course dingoes, which hadn't been terribly common before the arrival of the rabbit, proliferated because the rabbit was a magnificent new source of food for them. And when the first great sort of wave of rabbits passed through, what did the dingoes turn their attention to but the sheep? And they decimated the remaining flocks, what remained of the pastoral era. The Hensleys, for example, at Pinaroo, had accumulated losses of £20,000 on one station, Pinaroo Station, by 1885. Extraordinary losses. And it was clearly unsustainable. So it's really no surprise that the pastoral occupation of that Malley country really only lasted no more than 3 decades, 30 years or so. Its impact, though, even though it was only 30 years, it was profound. What the pastoralists introduced was new firing regimes. They clearly had a major impact on the vegetation from their hooved ungulates. These were the sorts of beasts which had never been in this type of environment before. When you think of kangaroos and their soft padded feet, padded paws, very, very different sort of impact to sheep and cattle. The first weeds came into the country. It represented destruction of wildlife habitat, and of course it also represented disruption and destruction of indigenous society. So although it was not terribly long, it was really the start of the avalanche of European colonisation and profound change. Now this is the Hensleys station at Pinaroo, and it's interesting from a number of points of view. I mean, there are very few pictorial records of the pastoral occupation. This is one of the very few. One of the things that interests me about this one is that the rabbits have already arrived. See the bunnies down in the bottom left-hand corner, so this must have been sketched sometime in the mid-1880s, I would believe. But you can see, though, they've made a brave attempt at subduing the wilderness, as they talked about in those days. They fenced in a front garden and they've tried, but they weren't there very long. Pinaroo Head Station was where the town of Pinaroo is today. Pinaroo is built slap bang where Pinaroo Head Station was. This is one of the remaining wells from the pastoral era. This is down in the southern Malley. This is Box Flat, just south of Lameroo. One of the very few pastoral wells remaining, and one of the very few that still holds water, still holds quite respectable quantities of water. A very stiff clay flat where they constructed 2 dams. More commonly, the wells. This is Smith's Well, again in the southern Malley, about 150, 170 feet deep. This one's largely fallen in at the top. The line, the sort of half-cleared line going out into the Malley there, into the middle distance, is where a trough was located, where they cleared the Malley and put a trough in. This is the WIM, the horse-powered WIM on Pinaroo Station, the main well there. And you can see, most of you are probably familiar with the action of WIMs. You harness the horse in the drum, the big wooden drum at the top, wound a cable, which translated into raising and lowering of buckets, often one bucket coming down while another came up. In the northern Murray Mallee, I mentioned steam-powered wells were more common, and this is Nildotty Well, a magnificent sort of industrial archaeological site on the State Heritage Register. You can see there the big chimney to get the draft for the boiler, and you can see the boiler where it blew up, came to grief. You can even see you can even see the hole in the boiler. But all the pump structure, the beam and the rods and the governor and everything, they're still there. In fact, the people who know about these things assure me that you could actually get that whole thing going again without too much trouble, in spite of its ruinous appearance. Not many of the stations remain. This is Bucks Camp down in the southern Malley. Garra Station is very much like this, but most of the others have long gone. And you know, in the not too distant future, it's going to be hard to find much evidence of the pastoral occupation at all. For example, that's a well, fallen in well, and you can see there the remains of the troughing, the rusting remnants of the iron troughing, the black iron troughing, which they typically use, but that will be gone in another few decades and won't be much to see there at all. Okay, let's go on here now. So we had a pastoral occupation that was only, as I mentioned, 3 decades. The profound change, the major settlement of this country by Europeans had to await new land clearing and development technology. In particular, the Europeans had to come to terms with how to clear this country, and they eventually developed that through mullinising, which really amounted to no more than knocking down the scrub with heavy rollers, scratching a crop in amongst the scrub, then using the stubble from the crop to burn the regenerating shoots, and by a very rough and ready process of clearance, they would eventually bring it into production. They needed ploughs which could cope with the big limestone rocks and which could jump over the big valley roots, and so the stump jump plough was uniquely developed in South Australia. And because they were exhausting the soils through their continuous cropping, given that they needed stubble to keep firing the Malley, they were running the soils down, so we had to have large-scale use of phosphate fertilisers. The country would not have been settled without railways. They were absolutely crucial. The Pinaroo line went through in 1906, very little activity before that line went through. Similarly, the Karoonda-Waikerie line, 1914, Alawoona-Yukini, 25, and there were many, many others. I won't go through them all, it's too tedious, but the message there is that this country was relatively remote, and it was not an economically feasible proposition to develop it until the railways came in. Vast areas were cleared. This was landscape transformation on a really massive scale. A couple of major periods of clearing, 07 to 14, just under 800,000 acres, and just over 800,000 acres in the period 25-29 in the Murray Mallee. That is massive landscape transformation by any standards. They initially did reasonably well, sufficiently well to be optimistic about their prospects, but they did not cope well with the inevitable droughts, and in these early years, the droughts of 1914, 1919 and 27-29 are still talked about in the country today. Hard on the heels of those early droughts, we came into the economic depression of the late 20s and 30s. And these were hard times. This is the stuff of Malley legend. This is when you hear of families really living on the edge. And they talk about people largely living on underground mutton, the rabbit, and living in not much more than hessian and iron humpies. This was really hard stuff. Prime Minister Scullin's Grow More Wheat campaign saw a tremendous spike in cereal production, only to see prices plummet to about 1 shilling and sixpence a bushel, which was absolutely disastrous for the farmers. And so throughout the 30s there was a widespread hardship. The government rushed through moratorium legislation to try and prevent massive property foreclosure by the lending institutions. The dry times produced farmer assistance, drought assistance legislation. This was really propping up agriculture in every sense of the word. That the country was in diabolical strife. It was starting to drift and blow after the 27-29 drought, and it was just an unhappy period in the agricultural settlement of the land. Well, inevitably, governments had to do something. They couldn't ignore the parlous state of the land for any longer, and so we got the Marginal Lands Act in 1940, out of which came farm amalgamation in the drier parts of the Malley. The number of farms halved. There was less cropping done because of the erosion hazard and more livestock carried. Post-World War II, the economic conditions changed. There was more massive land clearance and expansion. Leguminous lay pastures were introduced to crop rotations. The subclover revolution, which we hear so much about, perhaps not so much now. They're moving into more continuous cropping now, but that's another story. Larger machinery and mechanisation generally for clearing the land, improved cultivars, cereal cultivars, better agronomic practices, a great deal of change. Relatively prosperous times, but as inevitably happens with global commodities, the prices fluctuate wildly, and by the late 60s and early 70s, there was a rural recession that was widely commented on. And we also saw the emergence of community concern about ongoing land clearance and land development, particularly in low rainfall country. On the Victorian side, we saw the Victorian government's proposal to develop the Little Desert shelved after a very, very fierce controversy in the late 60s. And we had a similar proposal over in our so-called Tiger Country, what's now Narca Conservation Park. We saw that dropped after a campaign not dissimilar to the campaign against the development of the Little Desert. We saw a major inquiry into ongoing land clearance in South Australia in the 1970s, and out of that came heritage agreements in 1980, voluntary agreements to try and slow down the rate of ongoing land clearance, particularly in this dry Malley country. They had limited effects in slowing down the rate of clearance, and they were strengthened by the introduction of the first controls on the clearance of native vegetation in 1983, greatly strengthened in 85 and 91. Effectively, since the late 1980s, there has been no broadacre clearance of native vegetation in South Australia. In fact, in a recent amendment to native vegetation clearance legislation, broadacre clearance has been halted by statute. It can no longer happen in this state. Agriculture has stabilised in recent times. By and large, cropping practices these days see greatly reduced tillage, much better farming generally, the rise of a land care ethic, but one has to say the environmental impact of all this agricultural settlement has been profound. We've had widespread loss of habitat. Many of our native animals are now locally extinct, interesting spelling of extinct there, or endangered. We've got many of our remnant areas of native vegetation being too small to be viable into the future. There's extreme pressure on things like malleefowl from introduced pest animals like foxes and cats, and there's no doubt whatsoever we're going to lose more of our native fauna. No, not a shred of doubt about that. We should even be concerned about the long-term sustainability of agriculture. I mentioned that it had stabilised, but as recently as the 6th of June this year, we had a wind event at Sedan and Cambrai where wind speeds were estimated to have peaked at around about 120 kilometres an hour, producing topsoil losses out of the paddocks of between 50 to 300 tonnes per hectare, which is massive. I mean, that is just amazing. And the figure of the bottom figure there of 50 tonnes per hectare represents only a very few millimetres of soil stripped off. But when you you work that out over a hectare, that's the type of figure you're looking at. The maximum figure there of 300, and this has been arrived at by some fairly careful work, the maximum figure there of 300 tonnes represents removal of virtually the whole of the productive layer of topsoil, the growth zone of the cereal crops. Not all of the country had that sort of extreme erosion, but 50 tonnes per hectare was common throughout that Sudan-Cambrai area. Bear in mind also that all the climate change modelling is predicting even more marginal conditions for cereal growing in this country. The winter rainfall almost certainly will be lower and even more erratic than it is now. So the low rainfall fringes of this country will be even more difficult for cropping than they are now. We don't have any economically viable perennial plant species yet to replace annual cereal crops. If we assume, as I think we surely must, all the evidence seems to be pointing that way, that the country is going to get even more marginal on its northern fringes, we don't yet have a replacement for the annual crops. You can't walk away from the country. If it gets too dry to economically grow cereal crops, you've still got to hold the sand down. This is country which has been cleared, and it's got to be something which is going to produce a return, because it would be massively expensive to try and stabilise those cleared areas on any scale. The southern parts of the Malley, the higher rainfall, are clearly going to be okay in the foreseeable future. Much higher rainfall, much more reliable. I'm talking here mainly about the northern fringes. And finally, before we wrap it up with a few slides, bear in mind also that there's a sleeping giant in the form of saline groundwater, rising saline groundwater. It's still at a fairly considerable depth, but we've triggered a mechanism which is going to go on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've cleared the Malley. The Malley formerly utilised most of the rainfall which fell over that country. The pastures and the crops are not utilising the rainfall to anywhere near the same extent. So a great deal of rainfall is going down into the soil profile where it's mobilising the saline salts, and the effect is to see a rising saline groundwater table over the whole of the Murray Mallee. Now it's still a fair way down. It's not down in the southwestern area, Cook's Plains and top end of Coombe and areas like that. It's already a problem down there, Tailem Bend, southeast of Tailem Bend, but it surely will become a problem over wide areas of the Murray in time. And of course we know that it's going to add to saline inflows into the River Murray. So we've really had let's flick back a moment. There we go. I mentioned the primitive conditions of the 1930s, but they were arguably even more primitive when settlers first moved into the Malley. They really did do it tough. Many lived in tents for a great deal of, for years, while they were clearing and developing the land and accumulating enough capital to do something better with it. The railways, this is the opening of soon after the opening of the Pinaroo line. The country would not have been developed without them. Massive scrub clearance, pre and post World War I. Horse-drawn boilers, old steam boilers, pressed into use in this case, pulled by a team of heavy horses. But they also used bullocks. Bullocks were regarded as better pullers than horses, more steady, more inclined to keep pulling if they struck something really heavy. And of course, they did have prosperous years. I don't want to. It's easy to focus on the droughts and the sand drift and the erosion and overlook the fact that they did have some very, very good times, and they produced, and still do produce, very, very good crops throughout this country. And that's, I think, some sort of testimony to the boom times of the early years in the Malley. They were bringing in strippers in very, very large numbers, bring them in on the trains, unload them, get them out onto the farms, press them into services just as quickly as they could. And the times were relatively prosperous. They especially in the early parts of the 20s, they did quite well, and society was able to get into some of the finer pursuits that societies typically aspire to. The government was very ambitious and laid out all sorts of wonderful little towns, especially on the railway lines. Most of them were stillborn and didn't amount to anything, and others did prosper. This is Pinaroo in the early years. Pinaroo and Lameroo, Karoonda, places like that became big service centres, but many of the other little towns just really fell away over time. The old store at Mantung was still going when I went up there in the 60s. I just used to fill up my little motor car from that hand crank pump there. Bowser, but that's been the fate of most of the little stores and most of the little towns. Mechanisation came in from the 20s onwards and produced its own revolution, and of course the marginal land scheme, the restructuring of the 30s, the halving of the number of properties, has given you a landscape full of ruins, and very evocative they are. They speak volumes of the hard times. The post-World War 2 years, of course, massive scrub clearance, heavy mechanised clearance, really quite extraordinary. And it was clearance on that sort of scale which resulted in the government eventually deciding that enough was enough. The droughts, this was the Malley that greeted me in 1967. I actually thought the Malley always looked like that. I sort of went up there and I thought, well, this looks a bit dry, but this is the Malley, and perhaps it's typical Malley. Whereas we now know 67 was an extraordinarily dry year. But this is 1982, so you know we still get drought and sand drift on a large scale up there. I mentioned the clearing and the impact it's had on the habitat of the country. The Malley fowl is under a lot of pressure. It's very encouraging that a lot of landholders now see this bird as an icon species, and they're putting a great deal of effort into trying to safeguard it and its habitat. For example, the Mantung Magee Landcare Group systematically baits the Malleyfowl habitat and buffer zones around it for foxes. They bait with 1080 poison to try and reduce fox predation on the eggs and the chicks and even the adult birds. But the bird is under a lot of pressure. Little animals like Mitchell's hopping mouse, which we know were once relatively common up there, seem to be declining. The western pygmy possum, again, I mean, these are cryptic and nocturnal, and you wouldn't normally see many of them anyway. But one of the problems is clearing has so fragmented the country that we've got these tiny little areas now that even now seem to be non-viable. They're too small, they're under extreme predator pressure. You get genetic impoverishment of the species from inbreeding, and they're just not going to retain their suite of animals. So how do we move towards a productive landscape? Can we finish up with landscapes like this where we've got a blend of productive land with retained habitat? It's not going to be easy. A lot of the country looks like this. This is right up on the northern fringes, and really it's a challenge. I mean, this is the type of country I was talking about before. If the climate change modelling is right, then this is going to be a difficult country to sustain. That's 10-inch cropping country, 250 mils, and it's really problematic. Which I think just really in summary just illustrates nicely what I started out by saying. This has been a difficult country for humankind. It's dry, the rainfall is erratic, it hasn't got the surface water, and we've really struggled with it. I think the challenge for the future, particularly as we struggle with the effects of climate change, is really going to be to increasingly come up with sustainable ways of managing and using this country, particularly on its northern fringes. It's a fascinating country. A lot of people have got the view that the Malley is drab, it's dreary. It's far from that. I think it's a profoundly rewarding country to get to know well, and I hope I've whetted your appetite tonight to get to know the Malley better. Thanks.
Questions for Collin? I'll start down the front.
Bob Harriet. Mm. Bob Harriet really championed the soil conservation in the state. He was almost evangelical in his enthusiasm. He travelled the country extensively, exhorting people to do things like sowing cereal rye on those eroding hills to hold them down in dry times, and he did an enormous amount of good. There was no doubt about it. Yes, some people would say that we've become a bit complacent. I think last year was a nasty shock to a lot of people. I think perhaps some people had thought the country wouldn't drift again like it did in the 44-45 drought, which you're talking about. the 67 drought, but last year I think jolted a lot of people out of any complacency they might have been drifting into. This is still a very difficult country, clearly. Some people are worried about continuous cropping. There's lively debate about whether that's really going to be sustainable over time. Too early to say, I think. But yeah, a number of people would share your concern. I mean, technology and agronomic practices certainly have moved a long way. I mean, farm machinery is such that you can take advantage of opportune rainfall very quickly, and if country is starting to drift, you can get cover over it quickly, and you can re-sow very rapidly and so on. There are lots of improvements and lots of effective ways of managing the country better, but this is still a marginal country. No, it doesn't. I mean, really, there have been some recent suggestions that over southern Australia, where you've got rising saline groundwater, you would have to put back something like 60 to 70% of the original native vegetation to have any really significant impact on that. And economically, I mean, governments in Australia aren't going to do that. They just can't afford it. Which is why there's a hunt on to try and find something which could, in the way of perennial growth. I mean, one of the real problems with rising saline groundwater is that the annual crops and volunteer pastures don't use up much water. If you can get perennials, even lucerne, for example, where you can establish it, got very deep roots and uses a lot more water than, say, cereal crops. And so if you can get deep-rooted growth on that country, it will use a lot more water. But the hunt is on to try and find something that's economical, that will give you a return back for the massive investment you would have to outlay to actually get it in and growing in the first place. And there are some programs. South Australia is actually active out at Waite. In fact, in my own agency, the one that I'm just leaving, we've got a program which is looking specifically at just that. How can we get some perennial cover back onto this country that will soak up the water? The poor old marn, yeah, the marn. I weep for the marn. The problem with the marn, for those of you that don't know the marn, is that, look, it's highly significant. I mean, the Marne was one of the few rivers, occasionally still is, a river, which empties some water collected locally into the Murray. But the Marne has been impacted very, very severely by dam construction in the high range country up in its headwaters. Very large dams put in for viticulture, to support viticulture, and the impact of that on the Marne has been catastrophic. I just don't know what to do. I mean, the stable door has been slammed shut in a sort of way, but a lot of people would say it was slammed shut too late. And it's a real tragedy because the Marne has got endemic fish in it. It's got that magnificent red gum corridor woodland that it was just marvellous once, but it's not looking very marvellous. Yeah, the fate of the Marne is a microcosm of really the fate of much of the Malley. I think that the difficulty, I mean, there's a social and an economic and a political dimension to these problems. They're not just environmental problems. You know, there are people out there, their livelihood, their way of life is based on a form of land use which has grown up over a long period of time. There are whole towns and I mean, a lot of export earning is generated in this country in the good years. This country does grow very good crops, and it's not just a matter of walking away from it. I think what we need to do is to develop in the dry parts of the country, which might in the not too distant future prove unable to sustain cereal growing. We need alternatives. Certainly some areas, I have no doubt, should go back, and I would love to see go back to original native vegetation, but it's actually very, very difficult to put native vegetation back. It's relatively easy to clear native vegetation, but to put back the full suite of plants and animals, no one has succeeded yet in doing that. It's almost a one-way street. I mean, you can put something back, but the biodiversity value of what you put back is a pale shadow of the original vegetation that was there before it was cleared. So it's a tough nut to crack. But look, as I say, keep it in perspective. The Malley is very, very variable. You go from the southern Malley, which is pretty reliable, through to country which is decidedly unreliable, and it makes generalisation a bit difficult. I don't want to be a prophet of doom about the Malley as a whole, because that's not really the picture. They are growing some olives in that country already. They need to be irrigated. The rainfall is much too low for them to produce economically without irrigation. There are concerns about commercial olive growing, about escapes. Starlings and foxes spread them, and a lot of people are unhappy about plantation olive growing. For those reasons, I think it's highly unlikely that olives would naturalise in that country. It's just too dry. I don't think escapes would be much of a problem, but whether that's good use of the country, don't know. They're tough, they're hardy, but they would need water. They would have to be irrigated. They certainly wouldn't sustain themselves. Yeah, there are many comparisons. I mean, the Victorian mallee is very similar, but the main difference is that the Victorians didn't clear a lot of their mallee. Those of you that fly from Sydney to Adelaide, if you haven't noticed already, when you come to the state border, I mean, as you fly towards the SA border, well, let's talk about going the other way, Adelaide-Sydney. You fly over the Murray Mallee, the northern Murray Mallee of South Australia, it's all clear, effectively all clear, slight little pockets. And then you hit the state border and it's solid. It's solid, uncleared native vegetation. It's what's now their Murray Sunset National Park. It's all relative, you see. Victoria, with its relatively high rainfall country, regarded their mallee as being very, very dry and unpromising, and by and large left it alone. I mean, they cleared some big areas, particularly in the south central areas, but they left most of their northern mallee untouched, where we cleared ours. And you can literally stand on the border with your feet in cleared cereal growing country in South Australia and uncleared original native vegetation in Victoria. But they've got similar problems with rising saline groundwater, and they have got marginal cereal growing areas too. So they did clear some of their really low rainfall country. Yeah. The Murray... Yeah, the questioner was concerned about the state of the River Murray. Yeah, I mean, the health of the Murray as a whole is sort of a separate topic, and we haven't got time to go there tonight, but it's not divorced from what I've been talking about. As I mentioned, the rising saline groundwater in the Malley does find its way back into the trench of the River Murray and adds significantly to the salt loads. There's no doubt about that, which is why they're talking about a corridor, a riparian corridor. They're talking about growing, in effect, an interception zone of vegetation, perennial vegetation, along the river to intercept the saline groundwater flows. If you can imagine the Malley with all this saline groundwater under it, discharging that saline groundwater into the trench of the river, what they're projecting is a big buffer zone to intercept that saline groundwater and use it up before it gets into the River Murray itself.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. Over the last hour or so, I think you've painted a very interesting and clear picture on the history of the Malley, from the beginning through to the current issues, which are very serious issues and very real issues. I think, as you said, it is a landscape we tend to write off, and we drive through it or fly over it, and the majority of us would have very, very little understanding of the Malley. So I think tonight you're sending away 80 or 90 people who now have a much better appreciation of that, and that has come through your hard work and your willingness to share your enthusiasm for your subject. Thank you very much. I have a number of announcements and things to say this evening. Firstly, if somebody's got the attendance book sitting on their lap, could we have it up at the Secretary's table, please? We seem to have lost it, but I'm sure it's in transit somewhere. It's down here? Good, thank you. The second thing was that Adrian Brown and one of the school students here this afternoon played around with the PA system. I'd like some feedback from you over supper as to whether you thought it was more effective and you were all able to hear. Good. All right, well, the nods seem to have it, so that's good. The other thing I'd like you to let me know about is one idea which has been floated at the Society's Council, and that is to commence next year's meetings at 7:30 rather than 8 o'clock. So I'd be interested to hear your feedback on that as well. Particularly important, we thought, for the winter months where it can be cold and unpleasant. There are all sorts of functions happening out and about in the community. I have notices here for several of those. The first is a family affair to be held on Sunday the 12th of October at Pulteney Grammar School. It is a workshop on family history research, a sort of an expo, if you like, put on by the National Archives and South Australian Genealogy and Heraldry Society, and we'll also have a presence there. It is on the same day as our next field trip, which is a little unfortunate, but if you're able to attend that, I'm sure it will be a very interesting and worthwhile occasion. On Monday the 15th of September, which is Monday week, at 7 p.m, the History of Science, Ideas and Technology group will be having their September meeting in the Ira Raymond room at the Bar Smith Library. One of our members, Ian Schomburg, will be giving a speech there, South Australian Technology Pre-1900, a New High-Tech Society. And Pauline Payne has flyers for that lecture. I think it sounds a particularly interesting one. So I'll hand back Pauline that one, and you can wave that so everybody knows who you are if they come and see Pauline if you'd like further information. And Dennis Hoskins is always on the lookout for interesting things, and he has shared with me, and I'll pass it on to you, that a special occasion at the War Memorial on North Terrace this Wednesday at 10, when the band of the Irish Guards will march up from Parliament House, and there'll be a dedication service at the War Memorial. So if you've ever wanted to see that group of men who will look a little out of place in Adelaide, given they're normally at Buckingham Palace, that's a great opportunity to do so. Our next meeting, Friday the 3rd of October, and our council member, Dr. Christine Garneau, will present her paper Beyond the Garden Suburb, which deals with Charles Reid and South Australian town planning in the 1910s. He was appointed in 1916 as the advisor on town planning to the South Australian Government. Christine is in the Architecture Department at the University of South Australia, and she'll also be putting on a display that night. We also have a field trip coming up on Sunday the 12th of October to Rosebank, the home of the Melrose family, or the former home at Mount Pleasant, and also we'll be visiting Mount Torrens. But I'd like to pass over to Council Member Alan Forward, who has some interesting bits and pieces on display up there which he would like to share with you and to tell you a little more about that tour.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as part of the tour on a field trip on the 12th of October is a glimpse into the life and times of a quite remarkable family, the Melroses of Rosebank. Now, Rosebank is situated between Springton and Mount Pleasant in the country which I think is the exact opposite to the country that was so capably spoken of tonight, in that it's part of the Rhine Hills and a beautiful part of the country. Now, George Melrose came to South Australia in 1840, and he began a dynasty that lasted almost exactly 100 years. The last Melrose died in 1945, the year the war ended. And so this very, very important family lived in the area, and lived in Rosebank, which we are going to see. Now, I've mounted back of this room 94 photographs with John Healy's help that were taken during the years 1926 to 1933 by my mother, who worked there. Now, these were in fact the Depression years. We've just heard speak of the Depression years, and although I'm sure they did affect the Melrose family, they don't seem to a very large extent, because they still managed to entertain very lavishly. They still entertained politicians and businessmen. They still were able to play polo and take a great interest in local affairs. However, it's not that side of the Melrose family's life that I've illustrated. I've chosen from my mother's collection the more ordinary, everyday activities of Rosebank, which you'll see. The work that went on daily, and the people, the very large staff that produced the Melrose wealth. Unfortunately, there are no indoor photographs at all. I think my mother, with her box brownie, didn't have the facilities to do that. However, we are hoping very much, and this is in the hands of Terry Saunderson, who does coordinates our visits, we are hoping very much to see inside Rosebank. Not easy to do, I can assure you. It hasn't been accessible, with one exception, to the public for more than 70 years. The exception being 10 years ago, when it was opened for the sesquicentenary of the Mount Pleasant District Council. It was opened one Sunday, and vast numbers of people went to see it, because it's a very well-known and historical place. Now, for the motor car buffs amongst you, I have, with tremendous help from the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, we've authenticated all the vehicles, the fleet of vehicles that the Melroses drove, and you will see there that what we consider the modern phenomena of personalised number plates isn't as new as we think, because Robert Melrose was keen on them as well. Last but not least, if any of you watch the commercial channels of TV, and I'm sure none of you do, you will have seen there the most unspeakably drab program called McLeod's Daughters. One of the homes in McLeod's Daughters is Rosebank. But what the Melroses would think today, if they came back and saw this a group of totally undisciplined women cavorting all over their beautiful estate, dressed in singlets, I don't know. Anyway, I do hope that my mother's photographs will encourage you to go to Rosebank on the 12th of October. I have to warn you, though, it's not quite as you will see it on my mother's photographs of 70 years ago. So if you're looking for the overseers or the boundary rider or the wallers, they had stone wallers and rabbiters and all the vast staff that made up this huge estate, you will be disappointed. But I think you'll enjoy going, and there may be a few ghosts hiding in what was the 5 acres of garden. Thank you.